Should any morals come between your species and the struggle against extinction?
Or to put it another way, do any morals come between your species and that fight against the end? It's a pretty grim question, and it's exactly the one that our story for this episode is concerned with. It's a short story by Liu Cixin. I'm honestly very excited that we finally got to this guy. He was one of the authors that got me into kind of the questions surrounding reading translated Chinese fiction. We'll do the plugs before we get to the interview with our guest, a fellow Dundonian, just like me. So there's a pretty key plug I forgot in the last 2 episodes. It's that I've made a Facebook page and a Facebook group for the podcast. I'm not sure if they'll be a big hit or not, but for any of you guys who like to keep up or keep a pace with things, the Facebook page is there for you. If you want to talk to other fans of the show, I think the group is a good place where that could potentially happen, where listeners could talk to each other without me coming in the middle. But we'll just see if it's used or not. Doesn't matter if it's not, but it's there. We'll see where it goes. The other plugs, of course, if you want to support the show financially, that is, then there's 2 places to do that. There's Patreon, where you get access to bonus content, and I really should make some more soon. Or for a one-off contribution, there's Buy Me a Coffee. Links to both of those in the show notes. And to contact me or give feedback to the show, best places for that are Instagram @Trchfic. That's TRCHFIC, by the way. And I'm on Twitter as well, where I mostly tweet about the show, and that's @AngusLikesWords. The Facebook group as well, though, would be a good place for that, since we've got it. Anyway, enough waffle. Let us proceed with the interview. So I'm on the show with Adam McMurchie. He's a Dayingxiong Patreon supporter of the show. That is a big hero. And he's also a huge fan of Chinese science fiction. So a perfect guest for our ongoing sci-fi season. And he's come on this episode to talk about another big hero, the elephant in the room, as it were, of Chinese sci-fi. I say elephant in the room because we've talked about him a lot in this sci-fi season, but he's finally getting an episode. It's Liu Cixin, author of, best known for the ThreeBody Problem and arguably the godfather of the new wave of Chinese sci-fi. So we're not doing ThreeBody for this episode. I think that's been done on plenty other podcasts. We're doing his short story Devourer, which is one of the short stories that's collected in The Wandering Earth, his collection of short stories, which you can get in English from Tor in the US, and everywhere else in English, it's Head of Zeus. Before we go into talking about the story, though, let's talk a wee bit about you, Adam. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, where to start? I think maybe we'll start how we sort of came across each other. So,
Yeah.
I'm a bit of a mad sci-fi Chinese sci-fi fan, and I came across your podcast while I was on the London Chinese Sci-Fi group, which, by the way, I strongly recommend checking out for anyone in London. They do sort of meetups, and your sort of first podcast I came across was the Waste Tide, which was as soon as I listened to that, I found it like really, really engrossing. And from my point of view, it's so hard to find anybody with a sort of strong interest in Chinese science fiction, and so really coming across your podcast, I found it quite super niche. That's kind of like what drove me to you. Then I sort of started reaching out to you, and we just kind of took it from there. But I guess for me, my background really is at the moment I'm sort of the head of DevOps and environment. I'm also an AI specialist, and I've worked quite frequently in China. So I'm in China every single year, about 3 or 4 times. I also kind of speak fluent Chinese, and I'll be flying out again in a couple of weeks to do a few sessions on a sort of AI forum. So I guess from that sort of mixed in, sort of tech side and sort of background in physics, that really sort of brought me into the sort of sci-fi side of things. And then obviously working in sort of China, sort of these two naturally came together. So really from my point of view, I kind of see these two things as sort of a great symbiosis for sort of generation today, if you go to China now, compared to say 10 or 15 years ago, the attitudes towards technology and science fiction in general are hugely positive. I mean, they have definitely improved, and I would say even in contrast to the Western attitudes to technology and science fiction in general, it's much more positive. It's more outlooking and kind of with sort of anticipation for what's around the corner. Whereas I think we're a little bit more skeptical now, a little bit more dark. So I guess that's kind of how my background sort of shaped into the sort of Chinese science fiction scene.
I think it's worth mentioning we're both Dundonian, right?
Yeah, that was a bit of a shock. Yeah, so I'm being based in London, and I found it quite. I guess it was quite refreshing to get a taste of Scotland while being here and traveling the world, and especially since it's one of my sort of deep loves. So I wonder if there's something to do with Dundee and science fiction in general.
Not that I'm aware of. I think when you're talking about China, Dundee's a good context to have because it's so involved in first the Industrial Revolution and colonialism, and then later the movement of into the Far East. Editor's note, the line glitched here. I was just saying that after the Industrial Revolution and the kind of shift to globalization, Dundee experienced all its factories moving away to the Far East. I guess we'd also had a colonial aspect to our city, but it was through ties to East Bengal and India. Not so much China, but still. It's a handy context, I think, for when you're thinking about these things. That's come up in a couple of episodes, especially in this sci-fi season. But apart from that, I'm not sure what else sci-fi-ish there is about Dundee. There's the video games, Rockstar and whatnot, and University of Abertay. I suppose that has some of its little modern fingers in the sci-fi pie, but I suppose it's other bits of Scotland that are more associated with literature, unless it's William McGonagall, the worst poet who ever lived.
I wonder if there's something to do with the general scene. You're right, the Chinese Dundee connection's quite tight. Also, the University of Wuhan and Dundee have a kind of like a partnership and a joint sister university exchange program, which is kind of how
Interesting.
it's kind of how I came to sort of learn Mandarin fluently and work in China. And there was a lot of outreach programs back then. I was just doing a physics course over 10 years ago, and so it was very different, and there was competitions and awards to kind of go and do a summer in China, sort of like an internship. But from the sci-fi point of view, I wonder if it's just because Dundee's quite dark.
Yeah, I was going to say when you were bigging up the uni, I think the things Dundee has going for it are very good. There's a limited number of them, but one of them is the uni. It's a cool uni. And what you're saying about the outreach programs and the opportunities for connections with China don't surprise me. So we should probably stop boring our listeners talking about our hometown, although there might be a minority who are captivated. I'd like to ask you about your membership of the Chinese sci-fi fandom, because although you're saying we're hard to find, I think we're maybe a little bit like the stars in the universe. There's a lot of us. We're just quite, well, outside of China, we're quite spread out. Anyway, waffling aside, how do you consume most of the Chinese sci-fi that you read? Because I know it's quite different from how I've read it, which is mostly, for the most part, been in print, on books, in English.
Yeah, so I mean, there is, you are right. I mean, there's a lot of different resources where I can kind of get access to some of the more older, hard to get Chinese sci-fi. Fortunately, because of sort of legends like Ken Liu, who have produced a lot of hardbook in English, such as the Wandering Earth series and things like that. That has been really useful. But additionally, I read. There's a lot of online, shall we say, free sites which have all of Liu Cixin's material, especially in Mandarin. So when you kind of go on Baidu and you just sort of Baidu one of his books, it's one of the first sort of 2 or 3 hits, and you kind of like the full transcripts online. Personally, I do prefer to pay, but I know that in both English and Chinese, these versions can be they're very easy to access. Some of them are transcribed officially. So fortunately, the Devourer, which we're talking about, is free to view online, and it's officially free to view online. But a lot of them are not, and I know from sort of talking with colleagues, both in China and the UK, there's kind of mixed feelings. Most of us want to pay and support the authors, but I don't know the full sort of underground background reason for it becoming so easy to publish these online, because I don't think all of them are sort of authorized and supported by the author. Other than that, I mean, I generally order from Taobao. So whenever I'm in China, I'll order the sort of hard copies and take them back home in the suitcase.
And we should say, for any listeners who haven't heard of Taobao, it's kind of like China's Amazon. It's the go-to for your online shopping. It's interesting that you do that. My experience of these online versions, unlicensed online versions of Chinese books it's been stuff through this podcast, basically, where I'm trying to find some nugget or other on the Chinese language internet I couldn't find in the English language internet, so I'll stick a Chinese novel's Chinese name into either Baidu or Google, and then I found in the first page of search results you can find a chapter by chapter web text version of lots of books. I think I've seen Wang Shua's Please Don't Call Me Human and Mu Rongxuesun's Leave Me Alone. I think they were both right there. Probably not legal in a very simple text format.
That does seem to be quite popular, where people will upload just like it's almost like a parsing, like a screen scraping into a .text file. But personally, I try to avoid that, because it is good to sort of have the quality and the format of a reading.
Definitely improves your reading experience for sure. I think maybe a goal one day might be to get an IP rights, intellectual property rights expert on the show, but they would need to find me first. I don't know where I'd find them. So we should probably get on and talk about the story itself. But before we do, is there anything I've not mentioned about yourself or your things you read or your work that you'd like to mention before we continue?
No, I kind of think that's captured most of it. I mean, really, from my point of view, is just the sort of when we get into the book with Liu Cixin, I really sort of appreciate his attention to detail. Especially coming from a highly sort of technical background myself, a lot of the stuff he's published seems to be quite ahead of its day. So I'd really just sort of say, from my background, I guess if you're into tech or if you're into China, then you should definitely give Liu Cixin's material a go if you haven't already.
I remember in just about any little author mini bio of his that you read, he mentions that his first big job before becoming a full-time author was working in a power plant in Shanxi province, I think doing coding. But he's one of those hard sci-fi writers with the knowledge and experience to back up what he's writing.
I think I'm not 100% sure on this, but I think he still actually works at that power plant.
Ah, right.
Yeah, I'm not sure if he's like full time now, but last I was reading, somebody was mentioning that they think he still works there.
That's funny. There's a weird factoid. It's not about sci-fi, but do you know the author Cormac McCarthy?
Afraid I've not heard of him.
He's Blood Meridian, No Country for Old Men.
Yes.
That guy. The Road as well. So before he did The Road, there wasn't a hint of anything sci-fi-ish in his stuff. But there's a radio show, an American NPR radio episode, where he's talking about science with, of all people, Werner Herzog and Lawrence Krauss, and he was mentioning he goes to some physics institute every week or every month or something and does work in studies or discussions involving physics. So I guess it's not just sci-fi writers who do this stuff, although Cormac is maybe a weird case. Anyway, let's charge ahead. I think before we get on to talk about the story, there's a couple points worth mentioning about the Wandering Earth English language collection of Liu Cixin's stories. So first of all, it's not a collection of disparate stories from lots of different Chinese texts. It's kind of just an English translation of a Liu Cixin collection that already exists in Chinese, which makes it different from Invisible Planets or Broken Stars or some other collections of Chinese writer stories in English where they've all been pieced together. That's one point. The other point is its stories have lots of different translators. The translations have maybe been pieced together, although the collection is in English version, and the credit inside the book for all these different translators is collective, so it doesn't specify who translated which story. So therefore, with only the book, like as I had, with no research, you can't know which translator did which story. But Adam, you got on the case and you did some detective work about Devourer's translator, didn't you?
Yeah, so I did a little bit of digging, sort of cross-digging across the sort of Chinese websites and the American ones. I also found out that some of these individual short stories exist on the Amazon Audible, but some of them have now been removed, and the Kindle books have also been removed, which is quite weird. But the information sort of remained behind, and that kind of allowed me to figure out who translated what. I was then able to sort of confirm that on the sort of the Chinese pages. But there's actually, I think there's about 5 translators in general. So there's Ken Liu, which is one of the most popular and famous translators of science fiction into English. And then there's some other people, sort of Elizabeth Hanlon, Zach Kaluza, Adam Lanfer, and Holger Nam. And Holger's the one that actually translated this Devourer story. The information's sort of out there. I think maybe potentially what had happened were these books were originally translated as standalone, and then possibly at some point later they were brought together into a collection. But I can't be sure on that.
It sounds like that's exactly what has happened, and it brings up IP and rights again, because it sounds like when this collection was published, those old single editions had to be taken down because the way the rights deal must have happened. Did you find anything out about Holger, this translator, or do we just know his name?
He's a bit of a dark horse, I'm afraid. There's just really his name. I think he had translated multiple Chinese stories before, but this is his first Liu Cixin story. I haven't dug into his other ones just yet. So there's a lot of famous translators out there, such as Ken Liu, who market and brand themselves quite openly, but so far haven't found much on Holger Nam.
Okay, interesting. I think it's worth mentioning Ken Liu. Obviously, I've mentioned him on every one of these Sci-Fi Season episodes, because although he's kind of the paired translator with a lot of the Chinese sci-fi writers who have been in translation in English, I think Ken Liu is most commonly associated with Liu Cixin, and I think it helps that they've both, to some extent, it maybe helps that they've both got the family name Liu. But it's, in a way, it's a little bit significant that here we have a Liu Cixin story that's not a Ken Liu story. And the book, although I suppose Ken Liu was probably at least in some way responsible for this book getting out there, this is not a Ken Liu book per se. This is just a Liu Cixin book. But yeah, so I suspect that we've got quite a lot of listeners who have maybe read Wandering Earth, who are fans of ThreeBody, Invisible Planets, and so on. But I'm also willing to bet we've got quite a lot of listeners who've not read Devourer or all the stories in the Wandering Earth. So with that in mind, Adam, do you think you could give us a little bit of a plot outline or plot summary? And I think it's okay to do spoilers. So if you don't want spoilers, guys, you'll have to skip ahead, or maybe just wait until you've read the story.
Sure, I'll try to kind of give a little bit of a summary without spoiling too much of the story.
Okay.
I guess the reason why we picked this was simply because I think this story is kind of jam-packed with ideas and content. There really is a sort of a lot to talk about. It's set in the sort of near future Earth, where there's a sort of like there's a group of sort of soldiers, space soldiers, and their job is to kind of go on asteroid missions, and if they find anything that's sort of near Earth collisions, to sort of detonate bombs and deflect them. And during this process, they encounter a sort of a giant crystal, and the sort of crystal sort of interacts with them, and they find out it's actually fleeing from its homeworld that had been invaded by this ship, which is called the Devourer. And so the story is based upon how the Earth essentially has 100 years to prepare for the arrival of the Devourer. So if you've read the ThreeBody Problem, there's probably some pangs of similarity there already. And so they essentially, the story revolves around three main protagonists. One, which is the emissary of this Devourer ship called Fangs. The other is the human main character, referred to as the captain, later on referred to as the marshal, and this girl, which is represented in the crystal. In the Chinese book, she's called the girl from Eridani. I think she's also called that in the English book, but there's a slight variation on the theme. And so this book is all about how Earth is dealing with this sort of impending doom, the sort of negotiations between the emissary Fangs and the humans. But it's really, I guess, the key meat of the story is just how much jam-packed different analogies that are used. So there's a lot of different analogies which we can dig into later with, and the use of Liu Cixin's sort of universal worldview. Things such as this sort of term of vulgarity, which is actually really, really interesting. And there's a little bit of sort of gender, sort of, I guess maybe gender philosophy injected into the story a little bit, as well as some of your sort of traditional hard sci-fi grounding. So I think these things all come together to make the story so interesting. And it should be mentioned that the story is actually quite short. So I think there's 8 chapters. It's about 46 pages in English. A few other bits about the story is it was first published in 2002, but it's actually been republished several times, and I think that's a sign of generally how good a novel or a book might be, is if there's been so much work on it over the past. And Goodreads actually. So one of I always use Goodreads as a sort of a milestone marker for how good a story is, and it's got 4.5 out of 5 from around about 400 ratings. So
That's good.
So the story is grand in scale, but focuses quite heavily on, I guess, metaphors and analogy.
Yep, I think that's a good summary. You've avoided quite a lot of the spoilery plot points, which I think might have to come up when we get to like more point-to-point discussion. So, but we've spoiled pretty much every other story on the podcast before, so no big deal. So now that you've kind of set us up for this discussion, I know that you've done quite a lot of preparation yourself, and you told me you've got quite a lot of angles that we could look at it from. So let's go off your notes rather than mine. What kind of things do you see? You said that Devourer is pretty jam-packed with stuff, so what kind of stuff do you think is jam-packed in there, and what's the first thing we could talk about?
Sure. Okay. So let's start with this. The introduction of a sort of a fourth party, right? So we know that there's initially 3 parties. So there's this race, the Devourers. There's the people from Eridani, the girl from Eridani, and the humans. Now there's a fourth party which are introduced, the Ant. Now the reason why this is actually quite important is if you read this book, you'll find some things which don't seem to quite make sense, and the reason is because it's actually, and I was actually shocked to find out that it's actually a kind of a loose sequel to a book that Liu Cixin wrote much earlier called Of Ants and Dinosaurs. Fortunately, that hadn't been translated, but this is one of the stories that Holger has actually translated and will be released later on next year. So anyway, so there's a nice little connection to sort of an extra book, which I do think works really well if you read this one first and then wait for the English version, because I've read the Chinese version, and they tie in together. So there's no, I think you could read them in either order. But okay, so digging into this sort of idea, that there's a really nice part where essentially the humans are begging Fangs, so the emissary Fangs, to essentially bear them, and they try to use a lot of sort of emotional steering. So they invite him to an archaeological dig. and
Mm-hmm.
I think this dig is of an old civilization, potentially one of the oldest human civilizations, and
It's
they
in Africa somewhere, right?
right, exactly, yeah, and they give Fangs sort of an equivalent of a Carl Sagan box, but it's a book, I think, and
Yeah.
essentially they're trying to show him all of the wonders of Earth, and Fangs replies with some really profound. Um, profound statement. So first of all, he kind of he retorts, which is essentially, "I care not for your whole, nor for your hole in a hole." And which the humans are quite startled by that, and they sort of respond eventually after failing all avenues to convince him to show mercy. They come along something along the lines of like, "How could you do such a thing? Do you not have any morals?" Now,
Mm-hmm.
what Fangs does is he proceeds to sift through the debris of this archaeological dig. Bearing in mind he's about 30 foot, so he's
He's a
trying.
massive lizard.
Yeah, he's a massive lizard, right?
And
Exactly.
he's already eaten one of the UN representatives.
Exactly, yeah, and so yeah, I should have really given that. So he's he's sifting through this debris, and the humans are baffled by what he's doing, and he slowly, I think he pulls out some mounds of dirt onto the book, and proceeds to talk about the story of a great civilization, and that the civilization had endured thousands of years of turmoil, and their queen had travelled a vast distance, and they had technology, and they had stored information in what he uses as, I think he states, as ovoid capsules. I'm assuming he means eggs. And
Yeah.
essentially what he's actually talking about is ants. And he's inferring, reading this story, you wouldn't know if he really does mean that these ants are a super advanced civilization, or if he's just using a metaphor to describe, that it is another form of life which we just destroyed
Yep.
to dig this hole. And I think the way he puts it, he finishes off with this statement, which is, he says, we have a very many things to talk about, but let us not talk about morals. In the universe, such a thing is meaningless." Or in the universe, such things are meaningless. To, I think, gobsmacked silent. And I kind of, the story, I think that story is a chapter in itself, where he kind of really meticulously describes in detail this ant civilization. And I think the point that, there's a lot of points I guess the author's trying to get across. One of
Mm.
them potentially is it's all from a point of view and perspective, right? Where we don't see us as destroying these ants as being an act of of
In a
vulgarity.
moral act or a
Yeah,
vulgar act. Yeah.
yeah. And so I remember the first time I kind of came across that. I was quite gobsmacked myself, because
Mm.
it was not what I expected. So I think that was the sort of first part, which is
Yep.
kind of worth covering. And so the next part, which for me
Well,
was,
I
sorry,
have a couple replies to that before we go to the next point.
yeah,
So one of a thing I just remembered actually, this Leeds Genre Fiction Symposium I've been mentioning in every episode. There was a really interesting thing. One of the attendees, Nick Stember, a translator and kind of a knowledgeable sinologist himself, when we were talking about genre fiction, he talked about this study that had been done where these AIs were given huge corpuses of text, genre by genre, and it was the AIs were asked to analyze to look for patterns in each genre of the text they were given. And the two examples, because we were looking at sci-fi and crime, two things which are getting published a lot from Chinese to English, and the corpus analyzer AI spotted some things in each genre that humans might not spot as easily because of the different perspectives AI brains and our brains have. So for crime and detective stories, the AI noticed that there's a lot of descriptions of the interiors of rooms. But for sci-fi, the AI spotted that there were lots of adjectives and descriptions of scale. So very, very small things, very, very big things. And I think that AI finding matches exactly Fang's story about the ants and the humans, and then how the scale doesn't necessarily affect anything. The scale it just adds to the kind of irrelevance of morals into the equation. So that's one point. What was the other one? Yeah, so the gobsmacking moment where Fangs kind of gives this very grim, dark analysis of how you should conduct yourself with other civilizations in the galaxy. I feel like the ThreeBody Problem has that moment too, and it's not. I think it's not aliens who come up with this. It's a human hero, Loa G, where he comes up with a dark forest theory, which I won't describe to avoid spoilers, but it's a really bleak and certain description of how civilizations in the universe behave in a kind of kill or be killed way. And I think, at least when I was reading this story and that, it was a similar effect on me. I was just like, oh God, that's grim. And I guess the other connection with ThreeBody here is ants, because I think it's Dark Forest where there's a little there's a couple of ants point of view moments. I think that's Dark Forest, the second book.
It's right on the opening chapter.
Right. And does the ant come back at the end, or is it just the start?
I think it's at both the end and the start. I can't remember, but in the start, I think the idea is the ant is. It talks about how the ant's simple neural network is trying to traverse an area. It's making out some numbers or letters, and at that time, there's a conversation where Logi's introduced to the realities of the dark forest, and I think the theme of that is only the ant and Logi witnessed that. And then at the end, kind of the same thing again, potentially. But yeah, I think there is definitely a nice connection there between the two. I guess there's a few things that you kind of trigger my thoughts when you say that. One being that the scale analogy, I think that also is present in the prequel as well. And it comes to directly affect the psychology of the different scale of species, but I guess I'll not give too much away, but the prequel does involve ants and it does involve dinosaurs.
What?
Yeah, shock horror. Especially given that it's in the title of the name. But
Madness.
Yeah, there is. I think you're right. There is something about scale in science fiction. Actually, I think this kind of ties in nicely to Liu Cixin's. In China, he's always tagged with this term of hard SF, so hard science fiction, and I think one of the definitions is if you read the sort of Chinese interpretation is like grandiose in scale or super micro in scale. And I think Liu Cixin really tries to sort of push that in his interpretations of his stories.
Yeah, he's a hard sci-fi writer who knows he's a hard sci-fi writer and guns it, I think. And if we're talking about scale and the grandiosity. I think even though if you start talking about hard and soft, you still haven't escaped scale, because the scale of the soft sci-fi stories tends to be smaller. We've kind of started to talk about links or connections between Devourer and ThreeBody, and my theory is that Devourer might have been a bit of a proto ThreeBody story, like a first draft in a way. And I think you said you were going to look into like the timings of when each was written to see if that confirm or would help confirm my theory. Did you have a go at that?
Yeah, so it looks very okay. So there's about 3 or 4 stories which seem to come around about the year 2002, 2003 from Liu Cixin, and this is one of them. And I think the ThreeBody Problem was released in 2008 in China,
right,
if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's definitely common themes. In fact, if you read one of the Ken Liu's, I can't remember which one of his collections, there's actually a retelling of one of the ThreeBody stories, ThreeBody Problem stories that about the human computers in a completely different way. And so I think what Liu Cixin does is he builds up a repertoire of ideas and tests them out in small stories. And I think he stitched them all together in the ThreeBody Problem, which is potentially why it was so successful, because it had actually been an evolution and an accumulation of all his different successful works. Another one would be the Mountain. So I think,
which is also in the Wandering Earth collection, although I've totally forgotten the plot.
Well, I'll not give that one away. We'll try not to detour too much. But there's so the mountain is a beautiful piece about a group of sort of digital solid state life forms, and what makes so there's a connection there on the sort of physics and the grandiose scale side of things. And I think the Devourer really captures this dark outlook on the universe. And there's a few more stories that short stories which also have separate segments from the ThreeBody Problem. So they all stitch together quite nicely, and they all predate the ThreeBody Problem by about 5 years. So I'm guessing there's definitely a sort of a tie-in there. I'm wondering, there's a couple of other things I think was really worth talking about. So there's this translation that's used called tūnshí, which I've checked with my other Chinese colleagues who aren't familiar with the word, and I think, and so I found this quite interesting. So if you stick it in Google Translator, it comes out across as rough, and that's not the way I've used the word in context before. So the term "yeah" is much more common in this idea of "yeah man," which comes across as brutal or uncivilized. So you might say like "yeah man," which means
and where is Suya used in the story?
Right, so he comes out. There's a part where the humans are they've been given a last chance to sort of flee to the moon and let a few of them live on the moon, but the dinosaurs have said it's up to you to sort out your stuff and you have to steer it out the way. And so what they do is,
we should say, sorry, there's a twist that the big lizard Fangs is actually, he's an ancestor of the dinosaurs who left Earth. Feels like a goofy twist, but in a way it fits the kind of species survival view that Cixin has. But yeah, that's just a disclaimer to explain why we've been talking about ants and dinosaurs and why you refer to them as dinosaurs there. But we don't find that out until late in the story.
Right, exactly, and actually, I guess this just goes to show just how jam-packed story is. It's so hard to keep consistent when in review. But essentially, he's commenting on this process that the humans are doing to steer this moon out the way by using layered nuclear weapons, and he says in English, I think he comes out with something along the lines of, he says, you little worms, ha ha ha, what a wonderful idea you worms have managed to dream up. I love it. He then proceeds to talk about vulgar is he says, you are truly vulgar little worms, and vulgarity is the highest form of beauty. And so he kind of illustrates that the universe is actually vulgar in essence. And so this term vulgar is used quite a lot, and so they use the term tūnshí. Normally, we would use the word yeman or yemanren, but in this case, this tūnshí seems to be quite more appropriate. So I think this is an example of Liu Cixin kind of being a little bit of a wordsmith and coming up with a new way to generate imagery. And so yeah, and he sort of the story sort of proceeds where he kind of talks about this gets quite controversial, but he sort of the girl from Iridani is actually as part of this conversation, and she's kind of disgusted, and she retorts something along the lines of like, I think in the Chinese version she says, "That's lunacy. How could the universe be vulgar?" And Fangs replies with something along the lines of, "Is consider the sun as a raging, burning furnace in the depths of the cold abyss. How is that not vulgar?" He then proceeds to come out with something which I found quite shocking, and it's very kind of a bit of a surprise, but he comes out with, "Do you understand that the universe is masculine?" And he says, "Feminist civilizations like yours are fragile."
Or feminine, we should say.
Yes, sorry, that's right. It's I'm probably typing too fast. But yes, feminine civilizations like yours are fragile, fine, and delicate, a sickly abnormality in the tiny corner of the universe, and that's that. In Chinese, he uses the term 女人气, but when he talks about masculinity, he actually uses a different form and uses tūnshí, more like I guess it's a little bit more of a brutal term, but
Is that like warrior or?
yeah, well, I think so. Yeah, so I think it's like yeah, exactly. And
Is that Xiong from Yingxiong Hero?
good
Or different
question.
Xiong?
I'm thinking about it. No, I think it's more like a male. Um,
Okay.
so I'm actually typing it in now.
All
Um,
right.
okay, no, it is. It's the same one. It is the Yingxiong.
Ah,
So I
right.
did. So yeah, this it is the exact same
But
one.
they're not parallel words, is your point. So Nuren being woman for
Yeah,
the quote unquote feminine civilizations, and this, what was it, Xiongxin
yeah,
for the quote unquote
Yeah.
masculine.
Yeah, so it's
Yeah.
I think it's 雄性的, which is something like xing is like, bunxing. It means kind of like nature. So like your masculine nature. And then he talks,
Okay.
yeah, and so I guess what surprised me on this was it kind of felt like a rapid detour. At this point, the book had
Mm,
been kind of building up to a more positive, working away to kind of get humans to safety, and then this sort of brings it smack back down to reality with this sort of dark interpretation of the world.
yeah.
Yeah,
I think this, based on how male dominated, at least character wise, the Osician stories tend to be, and how badly the female characters, as as unnumerous as they are, tend to come off. I do wonder if this is him speaking through Fangs, because, or maybe speaking through Fangs with a stronger version of his own views.
yeah, no, I definitely agree with that, and I think this sort of ties into the other part where, um, the two main protagonists, the captain and Fangs, are the only two that seems to have a shared worldview, which is this:
Hmm.
the world's a very dark place. The captain's never surprised by anything that happens. Fangs has this sort of respect for him, and they both kind of agree on this. And I think, especially with the when compared to these other ambassadors who were shocked. I think that's also a potential um, way for the author to get across that, that European progressive culture is very feminine, and that Chinese culture, in his view, because it suffered so much, is much more skeptical and dark. And I think, to be honest, it is quite obvious in the text.
Mm.
So it's quite controversial, but that said, I guess it's quite entertaining because there's so many twists and turns that, to be honest, I didn't expect a lot of the sort of things that he had dropped in the story. Even though even though I guess if you're a big Liu Cixin fan, you should kind of be used to it by now. But
Yes.
I think it's just the way it's set up. It is very well timed.
Yeah. Bouncing on this point once more, just thinking back to ThreeBody as a reference point. So a character who kind of quote unquote gets the horrible nature of, or the fatalistic nature of things. I guess in ThreeBody that would be the character Luo Ji, who also by the time he's fully developed is kind of presented as a badass in the same way that this the captain character is. And I remember also there's a section in the books where Earth has become, I guess, scarcity is solved, everyone lives a nice life and it's all good. But then the Osician decides this makes all the characters not just weaker or softer, but he describes them as being more feminine. And, this definitely feels like it's maybe a recurring theme in his views. Whether or not that should interfere with how much you like his stories is a completely subjective question, but I do think it's something that really jumps out in his stories. And as I don't know, it reminds me as well that, have you read there's an interview slash article thing that he did he features in, it's about him, and it's in, I think, the New York Times by Jiayang Fan, their China kind of writer expert, where she's American Chinese. She went to China, she met with him, and they kind of spent a day, I think, in either in New York or Beijing, and she kind of did a little profile of him based on how he was
Yeah,
kind of behaving, and she quizzed him on. It got to the point where he kind of felt confident enough to have a little exchange on some of their differences in values, and he effectively defended what's going on in Xinjiang, the concentration camps. He said it's unpleasant but necessary, and again, it fits the kind of dark, shall we say, views or fatalistic views in his stories. And for some people, that might be a reason to not enjoy him. For me, I think this is the value of translated works from other parts of the world. You expose yourself to views that might be a bit uncomfortable or shocking. So I've mentioned that in the podcast before, but it's kind of how I view these things when Cixin writes them.
Yeah, I wasn't actually, I hadn't been aware of that. I thought maybe you were referring to a sort of previous interview that he did.
Right.
I think was also in the States, where he kind of got interrogated about weak female protagonists, which he sort of replied, well, Ye Wenjie was actually the main one, and she was very, very strong. But then
Yeah.
he then went on to say that he never embodies gender into his characters, and he adds the gender in after the story's been completed.
I don't believe that.
That's potentially not completely true. I'm not sure. I guess maybe this is a good time to sort of talk more on the sort of translation part, because I do think that Holger did a fantastic job, although he did seem to add a little bit of his own color into the sort of translation. So, for example, so the title is fine. So the title Devourer is translated as tūnshí, which is kind of like tūnshí. It kind of means like to swallow, or to devour, and then zhe is the sort of adjective of
It's
that.
like a person figure kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was fine. And then so most of the chapters, so like there's 8 chapters, and most of the titles were fine. There were a few differences. I guess the big one to mention was so when we refer to, I think the first chapter is it's called the crystal from Eridanus. In the Chinese, they actually refer to it as the constellation of Eridanus because it is actually a real constellation. So it's a real place. So where they apparently come from. Now the emissary fangs, I don't think there's an appropriate word to translate fang in Chinese. So they use the word 大牙, which just means big tooth. So he's kind of translated it as big tooth. So I think that was fine, and there's no problem there. In fact, I think that's just the author, the translator, using some imagination there. But then, okay, so then things do get quite interesting, right? So, for example, we'll start with a really simple one. He taught in the Chinese book, right in the opening part, they talk about something being very close, and they'll say, 即是伫离得很近, saying, even it's quite close. But the author uses much more snappy, saying it's right in his face or right in front of him, which is okay. But then as we sort of tend towards the longer sentences, the author's adding more and more details. So I'm going to read out, I don't know if I should read out the Chinese part, so I'll read out the English.
Oh, feel free.
Okay, so the Chinese...
You could do both.
Okay, so the Chinese part, it says, 它漂浮在漆黑的太空中，就如同一块沉在深潭中的玻璃. And so the translation of that is essentially saying that this crystal, it floated in dark space, like a glass sinking in a deep pool. Now, the author comes in and adds a little bit more. So he says, floating through the black void of space, it was hidden by the darkness like a piece of glass sunken in the murky depths. So you can see the author's starting to begin to add a little bit more arms and legs.
When you say author, do you mean translator?
Oh, sorry, the translator. I apologize. Yeah.
It's okay. I worked out from the context, but just for clarity. Yeah.
No. Okay, so we've gone simple, medium, and then finally we look at a more complex example where the translation should be he used the crystal's distorted starlight to determine its position, and it was quickly lost in the sparsely colored background. But the way that the author adds, it says, only a slight distortion of starlight provoked by its passage allowed the captain to make its position. Soon it was lost again, disappearing in the space between the stars. So it's kind of doubled in size now. So I think what's happened is the translator has a really good understanding of the sort of hidden meanings between words, and as the sentences grow in size, the translator is able to eke out the sort of unsaid Chinese insinuations into English, and so I think he's done a sort of a really, really good job of that.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Yeah, it's an interesting thing that you mentioned, the insinuations, because I'd heard before one thing a really good translator does is get the flavor as well as the meaning across. And I knew that in China the Chinese language is in general a little bit more vague, or as you say, has insinuations. But I hadn't put together the idea that a really good translator teases out the insinuations, because English isn't as insinuative, or if that's a word, as Mandarin. So that's an interesting point. So you've mentioned the translation of the story's title and Fang's name. There's a thing I did on the show a couple of times, forgot about a long time, and I'm trying to bring back word of the day. But I thought, in honor of Fangs, maybe we could do two words of the day that you could teach people like me who have gaps in their vocabulary. Could you teach us the Mandarin for lizard and for dinosaur?
Okay, so the dinosaur one is the nice and easiest to say. So that's Kunlong. So let's see if you
Kunlong.
Yeah, and so it's quite interesting, because in the actual first book it gets mixed up, because the second part of the word long means dragon, and so when you mix them together, Kunlong, it actually means dinosaur, and so the
Oh, is it Konglong, not Kunlong?
Oh yeah, sorry, it's Konglong. Yeah.
Konglong. Okay.
Yeah, and if you use it together, it means dinosaur. But if you take out the first part of the word, it means dragon. So in the book, it sometimes gets confused in the first book if you sort of translate it automatically. Which is why we'll have to wait till 2020 to get the full proper translation done. Now,
Right.
for lizard, I guess there's a couple of ways you could say. The easiest one would be xi.
Xi. Okay.
Yeah, and so yeah, essentially lizard. All
right.
But yeah, so Kong Long and xi is
Konglong, Xi. Okay.
For dinosaur and lizard.
Cool.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I quite enjoy having these wee bits, although it's hard to know how many listeners don't need help with Chinese. I certainly do, though, so at least it benefits me. We've talked a little bit already about the tone/quality of the translation, and you've mentioned the translators kind of teasing out of the language. How about like direct interventions, things that have been modified a little bit, maybe for the benefit of Western readers? Is there anything here that's changed significantly?
None that I could find. There's a few small things. Again, it's just like So I guess the closest I can find is where we in the beginning they talk about this sort of Asian cool as a captain holding his Asian cool, but actually. It's translated as a sort of 冷静的东方人, which is much more like the cool Easterner rather than using the direct translation. But it's all that sort of stuff. It's not the translator's not taking any liberties. There's very little in it, but I guess one of the biggest liberties I've seen would be in Liu Cixin's work would be actually in the Dark Forest, where a completely big plot is missing, which is I do really think that's worth talking about. In the English version, for those spoiler alert, apologies, but in the English version of that book, they don't, when they're talking about the ways that they can defend against the Trisolans, they don't mention ball lightning. And in the Chinese part, they talk a bit about how they would use ball lightning and these quantum shadows to attack the Trisolans. So it's actually a big chunk that's kind of
just gone.
Yeah, just gone. And it could be because Ball Lightning was released formally only this year, I think. But in the Devourer, I think Holger's really done well. If anything, I would say Holger's not been a person to maintain the flavor, which other translators does. I think what Holger does much more is add a hidden meaning. So rather than twist something completely to hold the flavor, he's mostly staying true to the genre, true to the context, but adding in a little bit that is still accurate as part of the translation.
That is a really interesting thing to know. So I have no segue for this. Just next question. It's really handy to have a guest who's got some knowledge of physics, and this is a hard sci-fi story after all, so there is some expectation that it will adhere to real science or scientific principles. So how do you feel about the realism or the scientific rigor of the story? Because like my take is the physics, it seems legit to me, although I never did physics at school, just did biology and chemistry, but then only up to standard grade for chemistry and higher for biology. And there's also the fact that there are big, silly, giant talking lizard dinosaurs, and there's a holographic manga girl, but mixed in with what appeared to me to be real science and stuff. So just to restate the question, how do you feel about the realism / scientific rigor in this story?
I think in general, Liu Cixin really does pay homage to good science, and in this it's kind of no difference. There's actually, if anything, there's a couple of plot gaps rather than science gaps. But so for example, the science is spot on. There's a few parts where he's so what Liu Cixin does is he tests science concepts and then rebakes them into future books. So for example, in this one where the Devourer essentially looks like a giant tire, and when it goes over a planet, it looks like a football in a tire. And he talks about this idea of the low gravity between the outer shell and the Earth, allowing them to do mining and strip and and pillage and plunder Earth really easily. He then reuses that same concept again in the Mountain and other stories, using this idea of a gravity differential. Also in the Devourer, he talks about things such as the velocity. So he talks about velocity, momentum, and angular momentum, all in the right context. So it's very hard for me to find any major issues in the science. I mean, that's not to say that they're not there, but at face value, what he's kind of done as well is he's restricted the physics to pretty much present day, when he sort of describes the dinosaur species as being very close to human-like technology, so no super tech, and so it's all just propulsion, delta V and things like that. So it's all done really well. The other bit, I guess, there's a little bit potentially that could be that could be a slip up where Liu Cixin talks about this dust cloud obscuring their path in the Milky Way and them having to jump from one arm to the other, but it's not enough to really pick at. In general,
and it's really captivating to read that bit as well. I love the idea of being trapped in a small pocket of a galaxy. That's one of my favorite bits of the story. So if it's not scientifically perfect, a casual reader like me, it probably works even more for a casual reader like me. That liberty enhanced the story for me.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think really it was really well done. And the part I really liked was this idea of layered nuclear fusion bombs on the moon and using that to steer the moon, because it's kind of like, again, humans acting within their technological limitations. They can't they can't steer it. But again, this will ring similarities for those who have watched The Wandering Earth or read The Wandering Earth. So you can see that these scientific concepts get reused, and I think that's a sign of a good author, where he's essentially testing principles, and if they come out well and there's not much pushback, he can then rebake them in a different way. And I think that's what he's done here.
Aye, well said. It reminds me. So I think as I said in I've not published it yet, but the last call I did for an interview for the show, I was talking about how I'm just a casual sci-fi reader. It's not something I really specialize in. So one of the certainly not a foundational sci-fi read I did, but a few sci-fi books I did read were some of the Halo video game novelizations, which have things in
Yes.
them the games don't. Have you read any of those?
Eric Nyland, I believe. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Brilliant. Brilliant.
they were good. But they're like a key thing that's not in the games was when the humans are trying to fight. There's big space battles between the human ships and the alien ships, and one of the humans' go-to weapons attacks is just firing nuclear bombs at the aliens in space, which
Seems
I
to ring a
suppose
bell.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. But me as a reader, I was like, what? We'd still been using nuclear bombs, but why not? It's vulgar. It works.
I think yeah, I think that's a great note to capture that on. It's
Mm,
vulgar, it works, and actually that's it is a really well piece of written science fiction. It won the New York
mhm,
bestseller, so I think the first two Halo books won the New York bestseller. So
mhm.
they did really well. Also some shout outs. I think that's Tor as well, right? So I think the publishers Tor, and they've been quite consistent with that kind of sci-fi. Um,
Mm,
but yeah, so I think for me personally, having the right amount of physics in sci-fi makes all the difference. I think that's what attracted me heavily to Liu Cixin, is that he does spend time to get it right. And one of the things that's quite surprising is Liu Cixin is not a one trick pony. So it's not just
no.
physics. I mean, he does it across biology and informatics, and in general, I think that's one of the sort of key defining traits. If you read a lot of Western sci-fi today, some of the areas will be good in the science aspects, but loose in others. Whereas
Mm,
I think like for example, Devourer and other books try to keep quite consistent across the board. So yeah,
mm.
definitely for me, if I had to rank the science in this book, I'd probably give it 8 out of 10.
Right, there you go. 8 out of 10. And is that for just Devourer or for the whole Wandering Earth book?
Well, I would say for the Devourer, it'd be 8 out of 10. For the whole Wandering Earth, I'd probably need to sit down. I think the Wandering Earth got, because it was so popular, it's been slated quite heavily. So a lot of
Mm.
critics have come on and talked about the idea of pushing a planet really hard. But in the
Yeah,
Devourer, I
I
think
think it doesn't help that the film adaptation was a bit lackluster.
yeah,
Have you seen the film of The Wandering Earth? Yeah,
I have,
not the
yeah.
best.
I thought it was brilliant, really enjoyable, but the science,
Mm.
I think Liu Cixin didn't have much influence on that one, and he
Ye-
said he was happy for them to
Yeah,
sort of go with it.
yeah, agreed. I think if I sat down and watched it with lower expectations, I might get something out of it. But I foolishly had high expectations. Though I know that there's an animation of ThreeBody on the way. Have you seen anything about that?
Yeah, so I saw the trailer for it. It looks really, really good. There's also, I also for those who are fans, there's a thing called My Three Body, and it's essentially the entire show, the entire novel scripted in Minecraft, which sounds quite.
Oh my God.
It sounds quite shocking, but it's actually fantastic. The first season, as you'd expect, blocky, but the second season, it's almost becoming more just like average animation, and the acting, and there's a lot of investment put into it. So there's a whole studio behind it, and they're working
Bloody hell.
on the third part, and so they're doing each season based upon the main character. So I think middle season was Luozi, and the third season's Zhang Beihai. So I mean, one of the things that is really important to mention is this is actually, we are witnessing the sort of rebirth of major sci-fi, mainstream sci-fi in China, and I think Liu
Mm.
Cixin is playing no small part. The Wandering Earth movie has been coined in China as opening the door to sci-fi. Unfortunately, there was just a new movie recently released called Shanghai Fortress, which some of the critics are claiming have just closed the door to sci-fi. So
Mm.
it remains to be seen, but I think in general the appetite for science fiction in China is actually increasing heavily, and if you contrast that with Western interpretation of sci-fi, you see that there is a big difference in the mainstream, being that Chinese mainstream sci-fi holds much more positive outlooks and connotations. So, for example, if you take the end of the Wandering Earth movie, it's much more looking into the future and the Spring Festival. But the Western sci-fi seems to be much more on a dark.
We've been hooked to dystopias for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think it's about 2000.
Post-apocalypses as well.
Right, exactly. With everything from, I guess, The Walking Dead to some sort of more brutal.
I think you could go as far back as 28 Days Later. It's a long time ago now.
Right. And I think the major turning point for me was 2006 or 2007. Oh, sorry, 2005 even, with Battlestar Galactica, because that was the it was the first. So that film style encouraged a lot of other following series to copy this idea of kind of wonky camera style filming, and
okay.
And so it brought out this idea of, realism. And I think what had happened was, this is just my interpretation only, but if you look at sci-fi in the 90s in the West, it was sort of Star Trek, forward-looking, Stargate, family-esque shows. And then I think what had happened was people had kind of got bored and didn't find much realism in it. And then sort of Battlestar Galactica was one of the first to kind of inject a mainstream appetite for dark and realism, and I think we're still riding that wave of where it's now become sort of hyper dark, whereas China's much more earlier on in their sci-fi journey, so things are still much more positive and forward looking, and so I'm kind of, that's what I think enjoy
the censorship bureau's got to help with that, though. Enforced positivity.
Well, yeah, I mean, potentially, I don't know, maybe that might be something, but for me, I guess it's a highly positive thing, because I kind of miss that. I kind of miss that in part of sci-fi, being able to sort of sit and relax to a more positive, straightforward plot.
Sure.
But yeah, I think it remains to be seen, because as we see in Liu Cixin is definitely a dark horse, and written literature doesn't seem to follow mainstream.
That is true. Remembering what you said about Minecraft, I can link this back to Dundee. So I have a pal who he went to Abertay uni and did one of the games type courses, and is working in a wee Dundonian company where, as far as I'm aware, they just make content for using Minecraft or related to Minecraft. So they're not making the apps that are going viral, but they're doing something a little bit like this ThreeBody thing, just making original content out of a platform that already exists for, in this case, a younger audience. But it's just amazing, the world we live in, that these things are happening all corners of the world. But taking things a little bit back to Dundee and to Scotland, I'm going to ask you some personal questions. First one is, when did you first really connect with sci-fi?
Well, that's a really good question. It's actually quite hard. I guess potentially it's sci-fi's always been a big part of my life. Probably since I was about 10 or 9. The very first Stargate movie, 1994. As a young child, I was very into sort of Egyptian and Roman mythology. I was a bit of a geek, so I'd stick around the libraries when I was like 7 or 8 and try to read kind of short stories, short Greek, Roman and Egyptian stories, and then the sort of Stargate came out and did something I didn't expect, which was try to mix mythology and science fiction, and that kind of gripped me. And then the TV show came out at the time when I was sort of like, I guess 12, 13, 14, and looking for something a little bit more action. And I really enjoyed it, because it kind of brought out this idea that, it was a stark detour from Star Trek, where most of the technology was set in the modern day. So that was my realism hit, I guess, before the sort of mainstream. And so I did a lot of reading of sci-fi when I was younger as well. So and some of the classics, and even Jules Verne and War of the Worlds pulled me in. So yeah, I guess I've been in it as long as I can remember, and one of the things I should really say for all of the listeners who are still with us is really get into Chinese sci-fi, because I think Ken Liu mentions this best, where sci-fi is just sci-fi, and there is
Yes.
there is definitely, you can definitely look, if you look hard enough, you'll find connections with nations or backgrounds, but sci-fi is just sci-fi. And if you get into Chinese sci-fi, you essentially double the amount of available material for you. And I do find it's quite refreshing to sort of get into something where you may sometimes it feels a little bit like rolling the dice, because you may read a Chinese science fiction book and find it's exactly the same as a book you may have read previously in the West, but then sometimes it's that exact thing that you're looking for, this unique, different, standalone story with lots of ideas, but I find that's the same with all sci-fi. So personally, I think one of the main themes of this obviously is Chinese science fiction. But personally, I couldn't recommend it enough, because essentially, if you read Western sci-fi just now and you do keep up with it, then you essentially are running
You've
dry.
cordoned yourself off, yeah.
Yeah, you're running dry on the classics, right? So if you've read all the classics, you kind of feel like, well, you read them, so there's not much left. But then in China, you've essentially got decades of potential classics to read into.
Yeah, I know that. So a lot of the stuff that isn't ThreeBody that we have now got is from younger sci-fi writers like Xia and Chen Qiufan. But a thing I found when I was sniffing around for my dissertation was another one, an author who's of an age with Liu Cixin, Wang Jinkang. There's an English translation of his book Pathological. That's published by Amazon Crossing, and Jeremy Tiang, a very good translator, is the guy who translated it. So if you, I have not read this book, but if you guys are interested in these older Chinese sci-fi writers, someone who's of an age with Liu Cixin, that's a good go-to for English translation. And if you're interested in the younger ones, definitely Invisible Planets and Broken Stars would be a great place to start.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think Invisible Planet was definitely a big one for me, and I think there's a great story there by Hao Jingfan, Folding Beijing.
Folding Beijing, yep.
Yeah, that's a classic, and I think you're right. So a lot of these up and coming writers seem to be in their early 30s, late 20s.
Yeah.
Which is great, because it kind of reflects, this new age of sci-fi. But again, from what I'm reading, a lot of it does seem to be quite fresh. So yeah, I guess really, if you look at it from a different angle, which is China's a very big developing country, or developed, with a much greater population than Europe and America combined, with a strong entertainment industry. So it's highly likely that the next 10 or 15 years will produce, the people talked about Liu Cixin as the next Asimov, right? Or the Asimov of Asia. But I think given the size of China, you can only expect to get more of that, such as like the next Ian Banks and so on. So I think this is, if any endorsement, that would be the one, which is there's a whole new repertoire of science fiction that I think will continue to roll out and eventually will grip the West. We talk about this, I liked your analogy earlier of Chinese science fiction fans being as stars in the universe.
There's lots of us, but we're spread out thinly.
Right, but I think that will eventually become more and more mainstream. Some of these Chinese science fiction shows are rolling out on Netflix, and these books are selling in Waterstones. So as long as they continue to sell, there appears to be a Western appetite for this.
Yep, that's an optimistic take, but I think you're definitely got a point there. That leads to my next question. Do you know what the first little piece of Chinese sci-fi you read was?
Believe it or not, it was the Devourer. So that's kind of why I guess we picked this one. So this is I remember reading this. It was quite a few years back when I was trying to improve my Chinese. And at the time, I can't remember how I came across the book. I think one of my friends had sent me a copy, and I was reading through it and translating it on the fly in Google. And even back then, even 8 or 9 years ago, Google Translate was still really, really good. And I just remember as I was making it past each part, I was coming on to more and more shocking revelations. So for me, this part does hold a sort of special place in my heart. And then I think the second one after that, the second major one I can remember was definitely the ThreeBody Problem. Quite sad, I know. Nothing super unique from that, but
nothing wrong with that.
But yeah, no, I also strongly recommend for anybody learning Chinese, pick a short story and just work your way through the translation. I think that's one of the best ways to engross yourself and get yourself into the sort of nitty gritty of sort of Chinese grammar and metaphors.
Thanks for the tip. So you mentioned before you've got a YouTube account with some China or Chinese language related content. Do you want to briefly tell us what that is, and then as a follow-up, have you got any plans to discuss or put Chinese sci-fi related content or discussion on that account?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for letting me plug my videos. So
please do.
you can find me. So if you just look for McMurchie85 on YouTube, and you should
McMurchie spell IE, right?
Yeah, so that's right. So MURCHIE 85. You should be able to find me.
And now we know how old you are.
Yeah, I know that's quite depressing, but yeah, there you go. And but you could also, if you still don't find me there, if you just search for "build your own AI in 4 minutes," mine's is the first or second search. Be it Google, YouTube, Baidu, any of that, you should find me.
Nice.
And so yeah, my channel is a mixture of AI, DevOps, and techie stuff that I've built. But it's also got a Chinese swim lane. So if you go in there, you'll see a Chinese swim lane where I talk about different AI and technology things in Mandarin Chinese. And so the next part is to have a swim lane where I sort of comment on Chinese fiction from the point of view of a Westerner. And so yeah, I guess the next couple of months I'll start to put up videos, and I guess one of the first things I'm looking at sort of talking about would be the mountain, because I think that's quite shocking for a lot of Westerners, because it's very, very scientific. so that's why I liked it so much. McMurchie85, or build your own AI in 4 minutes and you'll find me.
What was that word you were saying? Was it swim lane?
Yeah, so a YouTube swim lane is if you think of like your video reel, and you can split your YouTube channel into swim lane.
Okay, cool. It's a wee bit like a publisher in their imprints, little subcategories, brands within the brand. The curiosity satisfied. So we plugged your YouTube. Is there anything else you want to plug before we bid you farewell?
No, I guess that's it. Just really to say thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to seeing more of your interviews, and hopefully pop on one later on in the year, next year.
Yeah. Well, as I said to the last guest, you're welcome back anytime, but obviously not the next episode. That would be weird.
Yeah, for sure. But no, thanks for having me on. I guess for all of those listening, please give Devourer a go. Even though I don't think we've spoiled everything. There's quite a few twists and turns in it, so it's definitely worth a go.
Yep, and that's in the Wandering Earth collection of short stories published by Head of Zeus everywhere except North America. In North America, it's Tor. And that upcoming title, Ants and Dinosaurs, that's also by Tor and Head of Zeus. And that's available for pre-order now. I pre-ordered it when I was doing my Christmas shopping for everyone else, but got myself that. But yeah, I think we've done our corporate masters the favor that they demanded. So it's probably time to say bye-bye.
So thanks again for having me on, and catch you next time.
Well, thank you again to Adam McMurchie for being on the show. That was a fantastic chat, and I think it was great that for the important milestone of covering Liu Cixin, we got a real fan of Chinese sci-fi and fan of science as well. Hard science, hard sci-fi. I think that's a perfect guest. As I've said before, we're not exclusively looking for authors, translators, academics, people who enjoy you have to be, I think the key criterion to be a guest is to enjoy the stuff we read. That's it. So if you'd love to be on the show, then I'd love to have you on the show. Just zap me a message through, Instagram comments or DMs. That's at Church of Fic. Twitter, it's at Angus Likes Words. What else can I plug? There's the Facebook group, the Facebook page. Just stick the name of the podcast in the search bar in Facebook. That should do it. And yes, the most important thing you can do, it's word of mouth, just telling people who might like the show about the show. So who could you tell this time? Obviously, of course, tell your dog, but also tell the massive dinosaur emissary of the alien race that has entered the solar system and is coming to your planet to eat you. Tell that giant dinosaur lizard, because they might like the show. On that note, 再见。
今天就像一封写好了信，等着贴上一枚新邮票。因为我心里没有平静，遗忘的只能剩下美好。过去就像脑里翻腾的喧嚣，繁星在梦里闪耀，让我